Hey everybody, and welcome back to Jim's Garage. This is a video that a lot of you have been asking for and probably couldn't come at a better time, as I've recently just covered Cloudflare Tunnels and also things like TwinGate. And that's right, I'm talking about Pangolin. So let's get straight into this. I'm going to give you an overview of what Pangolin is and how it works, and then we're going to set up a demonstration whereby we're going to be exposing all of our services through our own self-hosted tunnel. So the first question is obviously, why would you want to use Pangolin? What does it give you that other solutions don't? Well, I would start by saying that this is pretty much Cloudflare Tunnels with TwinGate baked in, all whilst being self-hosted. So what does that mean? Well, it's going to allow you to expose services without doing any port forwarding. It's also going to allow you to then put in granular controls over what can access what. You're going to be able to specify different users, different levels of access, and also different authentication layers. It kind of takes the best of both of those products and puts them into one self-hosted solution. So let's dive straight into a diagram and let's have a look at how this is actually pinned together. Now there is still the argument of why would you want to do this versus using something more traditional like say a mesh VPN, something like Netbird, or just a simple WireGuard. Many people, if you can port forward, will still prefer to go down that route, but if you can't, say you're behind CGNAT, this could be the right way to do it. Also, if you just want to have something that is designed to be publicly available, let's say a website for example, this again could be an easy way to do it. The beauty here is what you can see in the diagram. So here we can see our users on the edge, and as with my demonstration in this video, we're going to be taking advantage of a VPS, a virtual private server. Now this can be something that's hosted on a third-party website. I'm going to be using Hetzner. You can use any third party you wish, or you could even self-host this in your home lab, or even at a friend's house, family member, whatever. It really doesn't matter. But as you can see, the first thing that we're going to hit is actually Traefik. And as you know, I love a bit of Traefik. The beauty of Traefik is that it has many middlewares that we can bake in, many complementary security features. So, for example, during the installation, it's going to ask you whether you want to include Crowdsec or not. Now, Crowdsec acts as a web application firewall, and it's going to be able to inspect all of the traffic that comes into your environment. That's obviously great, and something I spoke about in my last video, where we looked to improve on Cloudflare Tunnels, which if you just do it in sort of the traditional vanilla approach, it's going to set up an encrypted tunnel between the connector and Cloudflare's edge, but A, Cloudflare can read all that data, and then B, you're directly accessing the service without a proxy, which means that none of that traffic is going to be inspected on your end. The beauty of Traefik as well is that you can add another authentication and authorisation layer, which again is an improvement over something like Cloudflare. So when you're actually accessing a service through Pangolin, you're hitting the VPS first. We'll get onto what's actually happening, but ultimately you're then connecting over a WireGuard tunnel into, let's say for example, this is your home lab down here. So how does that actually work? Well, you come into Traefik, which acts as a reverse proxy, but that reverse proxy also has this badger component, which talks to Pangolin. Now, have a look on the right-hand side here, and it gives you a simple breakdown of what those things are. So Pangolin is the web front end, which we're going to be integrating, and it makes management really simple through a really powerful and intuitive UI. I'll give you a quick demo of that so you can see what we're going to set up, and then we'll talk about how we're actually going to set it up. Now, Pangolin is the mastermind behind sort of setting up your users, creating all the rules, exposing resources, setting SSL, and also doing things like authentication and authorization. Now, the way that works is when you make a change in Pangolin, you can see this arrow is bidirectional. When you make a change in here to a resource, it obviously needs to then update the records within Traefik. So this uses an API to communicate with Traefik, and then it will add the necessary routing within Traefik so that when this person accesses a service on a different subdomain, so I don't know, let's say you want to look at PhotoPrism, let's say you want to look at TrueNAS, Portainer, whatever, it knows which record is which and it sends it to the right place. Now that all takes place courtesy of this bit on the left here, which is Gerbil. And if we see, this is the WireGuard interface management. So Gerbil can actually have multiple newts, and newt is basically the WireGuard implementation for Pangolin. And this acts as kind of a connector like you would see in something like TwinGate or in Cloudflare. And this communicates back to your VPS. Now you can have multiple of these edge servers. So you could have one newt in each of your home labs or each of the areas that you want to connect to, and all of those will connect back to Gerbil. Now the beauty of this system is there's no port forwarding required, and that's because of this connection here, this WebSocket. Now traditionally web communication is usually unidirectional. You make a request, it sends a reply, you make another request, it sends a reply. But the beauty of WebSockets is they are bidirectional. So much like you might be using something like Discord or anything basically real-time, gaming, etc., the beauty of WebSockets is we're able to take advantage of fast bidirectional communication, which is the glue that kind of binds all of this together. So this setup is really powerful because it's seamless. You only need to expose 3 ports on the VPS to make this work. That's HTTP, HTTPS, and the WireGuard 51820. This works as well by creating its own valid SSL certificate. I'm using Cloudflare in this instance, and that's pretty much all you need to get this up and running. It really is well thought out. So now that we've gone through a bit of the theory on the architecture side, let's have a look at what this looks like in practice. Now for this example, you can see that I only have 2 domain records. I basically got Pangolin, which is pointed to my VPS, which is just a cheap Hetzner VPS. And then I've just got an asterisk, basically a wildcard for a subdomain. So anything that's going to be accessing on jimsgarage-demos.co.uk is going to get routed over to that VPS. And that actual VPS looks like this. This is what is hosting Pangolin. You can see here that I've got this Jim's Garage site, and that Jim's Garage site is my home lab, the one that I use for basically all of my videos. And here you can see this modest current, nice name, a random name for a container. This here is actually the connector to this Pangolin. So if I didn't have that container, which you can see is newt, and remember from the previous section, newt is that WireGuard tunnel. If I didn't have that there, then this wouldn't be showing as online. What this means is my home lab is connected to Pangolin. And as I said before, if you've got multiple different sites, i.e. multiple different home labs, or maybe different regional sites if you're a business, different offices for example, you'd have one of those connectors at least into each of those respective domains. They would then also all show down here. Now, you can actually break that up further using the notion of organizations. I've only set up one organization, but you could have multiple organizations, and each organization could have multiple sites. That will become a little bit clearer as we go through the install wizard later in the video. Once we've done that, we basically have resources. So I've only got the one resource here. I've just exposed Portainer. Now, if I click that, it should load up Portainer, and this is all doing it over the internet. Now, this is not the same Portainer as this. This is one I've just set up for this demonstration, and this isn't port forwarded on my firewall. So the only way we're actually getting access to this is through that Pangolin tunnel. We can check that by if we click on here, and then if I go back, if I actually go to this resource here, I click edit, I can actually then just disable this route, and I'll save that target. Hopefully now if I click refresh, yeah, there's no available server. So you can see just how simple it is to expose things and just how simple it is to disable them. Now, none of this would be any good without users and roles. So here we've got a list of our users. Now, I've only got myself on here, but obviously if you wanted to have more people, you would just click invite users. You could then put their email address in here, select the role that you want them to have. You can create more roles, say how long you want it to be valid for. That's the invitation link, and then send that out. You can obviously go into roles, you can add new roles, you can talk about what they want and give them the requisite permissions that you want them to have. You would then assign roles to a resource. And you can see quite handily at the top the order in which you do things here. You create a site, you create resources, you assign users and roles, and you can also then create shareable links. This is quite cool. This is a way to give somebody access to something temporarily. So you can click create a share link, choose the resource you want, and you can say how long you want them to have access to it. And that'll be done through some sort of token or session, which will expire after that date has been met. You also get some handy metrics here. And again, if we go back to our diagram, this is all handled sort of by Gerbil and that connection down to newt, which will give you those web metrics so you can keep an eye on what traffic's going through your network. Lastly, you might be thinking this all sounds really good, but I imagine it's a pain in the backside to actually deploy. No, that's not true at all. We're going to actually use the automated installer. Now, do note that there are different ways to do this. So Docker Compose, Unraid, for example, those are the manual installation guides. Now I'm going to use the automated installer, and that's simply because it's going to create all of the files we'd have to create anyway if we did the manual installation. So I think even if you want to do the manual installation, go down the route of using the automation, and you'll see later in the video that when we actually go through this process, we can then go back and edit those files it's created through the wizard anyway. I think that's a much easier solution than having to go through here and change everything automatically. Maybe in a more production setup whereby you've got, say, CI/CD pipelines, etc., infrastructure as code, it might make more sense to go down that route, but I think for a home lab, this is probably the best way to go. But up to you, you've got the choice, which is always great. So go ahead and register a domain. Create some records like you can see here. This will have to point to the IP address that you're hosting the Pangolin dashboard on. In my instance, that is a VPS over in the cloud here. You can obviously use whichever one you want, but make sure you've got that record. Make sure you've got something to install this on. And now let's head over into the installation. So now I've connected, you can see down here, to that Hetzner box in the background that I showed earlier. And the first thing we really need to do is to go over to the Pangolin installation wizard and grab the script that we need for this. So over on the install site, let's copy this, and then we're going to head back now into our terminal, and we should be able to paste this in. This is going to bring down the actual installation and then change the permissions so that we can actually execute it. So now that's been able to bring that down, and the next step is basically just to run that. The beauty of running this is it's going to ask us for a load of information so that it can auto-configure it. Like I said, we'll then be able to look at those files it's pulled down, and you can almost use this as a sort of cheat method for making sure that you've got the manual files configured for your setup. So if I run the /installer, we should begin that process. Now it's going to ask us to enter the base domain. Now for me, that is the Jim's Garage demos.co.uk. Obviously change this to the root domain, don't put in the Pangolin piece, the subdomain that will come next. You can see that the default here is pangolin dot and then your domain, so I'm going to hit return. It's going to say what's the email address for your Let's Encrypt certificates. Now for me that's using Cloudflare as my domain registrar, so I'm going to put in my email address now for Cloudflare. After hitting return, it's going to ask if we want to use Gerbil to allow tunnel connections. So if you remember, Gerbil is that WireGuard management system. So we're going to use yes, because that's kind of default and what's expected, albeit you can do this through WireGuard if you wanted to, but I don't think there's any need to introduce some additional complexity here. After that, it's going to ask us to put in a password, so generate something strong and complex because this is going to be exposed to the internet. Once you've added your password, it's going to say whether we want to disable sign up without an invite. So I'm going to say yes, and what that will do is it will restrict that process to only registered users. Now you need to decide whether you want people to be able to make new organizations. The default is no, which is good because not everybody is probably an admin, so I'm going to leave that as is. But if you're only adding people who you trust, or maybe just admins for example, you might want to default this to yes. You can change it at a later date anyway. Next, it's going to ask you whether you want email functionality. Now that is helpful because you'll be able to send out emails using a valid email address through something like SMTP. Now, I don't know what the setup's going to be for all of your email providers. I use Gmail, but again, I'm the only one that's going to be using this, so I'm not too fussed about it. So if you click yes, go and get your SMTP credentials and put that in here. Otherwise, just hit no and you can continue, and you can also add that later. Now, because everything on here is running with Docker, it's detected that Docker isn't installed. So it's asking whether we want to install it. So obviously I'm going to say yes. And the beauty is this is going to go away, use a convenience script and all that sort of stuff for Docker, pull everything down, automatically pull all the containers, use the variables we've just specified in this wizard to populate all of those container compose files, and then we should be off to the races. So let's hit yes and let's continue. So here you can see it's going off and it's pulling all of the images that we need, all of the different variables, binaries, etc. And now once that's completed, it's asking us whether we want to install and start the containers. Now for me, I want to say yes. So if we hit return, it should go away now, and you can see it's pulling all of the different containers, and it should automatically spin those up, put them on the right networks, and it should also pull that certificate because we gave it our Cloudflare credentials. And so hopefully this should all be working once this is finished. For those of you wondering how in this video it's able to pull down your certificate with just an email address, that's because in this video it's actually using a TCP challenge, whereas in my previous videos I've used a DNS challenge. The TCP challenge works because we're forwarding port 80 on the Pangolin instance, so it's able to do the challenge and match the IP address with the domain record. But in my previous videos where I've used a DNS challenge, which is generally what I prefer because it means that you don't have to port forward, you need to use your email address and your API key. So now we've started the containers and we're pretty much ready. We've now got this additional option of whether we want to use Crowdsec. And that's what I mentioned earlier in the video and why I like the fact that this is using Traefik baked into it. We get the additional security benefits of using something like Crowdsec. Now you actually get the choice of whether you want to install Crowdsec or not. The default is no, so if you don't want to run it, just go for that. But it makes sense in my opinion to use Crowdsec for the added security it's going to bring, albeit it is a third party that you're going to have to depend on. And if they don't play nicely in the future, you could be in a rough spot. So do bear in mind there are risks associated with adding this in terms of potential downtime, but I think the security outweighs it, especially if you're doing this in a home lab environment anyway. So let's click yes. It's then going to ask us that are you prepared to monitor and manage this yourself? I'm going to say yes. That should then take the containers down. It should install and pull Crowdsec, and then it should bring them back up. And fingers crossed, everything should be working as expected. So let's just see what happens. So now hopefully everything should be working. And we should now be able to go into our browser. We should be able to go to the domain record that I showed earlier for the Pangolin dashboard, and we should be able to log in for the first time using the credentials we specified in the wizard. Let's give it a try. So let's hit return, and fingers crossed, yes, we've hit the Pangolin dashboard. So now we should be able to log in with the credentials we specified in the installation script. And once we do, we're into the wizard for creating our first org. So this is what I mentioned earlier. So this organization name, I'm going to call it Jim's Garage. It automatically generates an ID, but you can specify your own if you want. Let's hit create org. And now we need to create our site. So remember what I said before, we've got the dashboard on the VPS, but this site is actually my home lab. So it's exposed through the VPS with no port forwarding, etc. But the actual site, i.e. the services I want to expose by Portainer, TrueNAS, whatever it might be, we do that through adding a site. And the site, you can see, uses a tunnel. So I'm going to give this site a name. I'll just call this Home Lab. We do get an option of what tunnel type we want to use. So you can actually use WireGuard because Newt is basically WireGuard under the hood. But Newt specifically has been expanded to take advantage of the various features I mentioned before, things like the WebSocket, etc. So I do recommend using Newt, but do know that you have other options as well. And then we have to go down here to actually get the credentials we need to connect this. So much like a normal WireGuard connection, there's going to be tokens associated with this. Now, thankfully, Newt actually takes care of all of the tokens, etc., because it's making advantage of WebSockets. So all we need to do really is we need to acknowledge that we've copied the key. Do take a note of these because you'll need this for any site you want to use to connect to. Each time you do create a new site, you will get a new set of keys. Now, it does give you options for where do you want to deploy this. So, for example, if you want to use a binary on Linux, you would choose Linux and then choose your architecture. I'm going to be using Docker for this one, and you do get the convenience of having Docker Compose or Docker Run. You choose exactly what it is you want. I'm just going to be quick and easy on this one, and I'm going to use Docker Run. Now you can see here that it's actually got the ID and the secret appended into that, and it's also specified the endpoint, which is this one that we're on here. So behind my head there's a handy copy button. I'm going to hit the copy button, and now I'm actually going to connect to my local Docker host, and you'll see that in a moment. Now that I'm connected into my local host, I can actually now run this command. So if I do this sudo and then docker run, let's hit return. That should pull the container, and now that's trying to connect. Now it's failing because it's saying there's no Newt found with the ID. Now you might be wondering, why is that? Well, that's simply because, again, behind my face down here, we haven't actually saved this credential. So in the bottom right hand corner, let's click create site. That should now be created, and we'll hit save. Now if we go back to our Visual Studio, you can see here now that it's actually moved on. it's got this WireGuard tunnel here, it's received the message, it's registered, and it's now set up that new WireGuard device here. So fingers crossed, if we now go back into our dashboard, if we go to sites here, we should see it green and online. Perfect, yes we do. So basically now we have our home lab connected to the VPS. And the next thing we need to do is the resources. Now before we do spin up a resource, let's have a think about what we've just done. We've created this site and we specified that it was going to use a Docker container, but we could have used a binary, we could put this in an LXC, we could put it in a VM. It doesn't really matter. There might be some things that influence that decision based upon how comfortable you are with routing or exactly how you want to isolate this connector. For example, this is in a Dockerized environment, so whatever firewall rules basically my Docker host has, this connector is going to pick those up. Now to make life easier, you might want to put this connector on a VM or something else that's discrete, and then you could have explicit firewall rules on your end. So for example, within my OpenSense firewall, I could give this connector very specific access, and that would go above and beyond what we can do in the user policies and also the resources which we'd create in a minute. So you could almost have maybe, I don't know, your own bespoke DMZ within your home lab, and this connector can only access the DMZ and it can't access any of the internal network. Now that would be helpful in case there's any user error or somebody, a different admin in your organization, accidentally tries to expose the wrong service. This connector wouldn't be able to connect to it. I'll explain what that looks like now. So let's click add a resource. Now let's say for example I want to expose Portainer, which I don't recommend. It's just a convenient service that I have up and running for this demo. I don't recommend it because you generally shouldn't be exposing anything administrative in terms of paneling to the internet. Now the site is home lab. We only have that one site, but as I mentioned before, if we had multiple sites we'd get that in this drop down here. Now, importantly, we can not only do HTTPS resources, i.e. web stuff, but we can also do raw TCP and UDP. So, for example, you could set up things like a game server, for example, on here. Now, we're going to use HTTPS because that's what it is, and we need to think about what the subdomain is. Now, the subdomain for this is going to be Portainer, and because we've got that wildcard, again, you might want to be prescriptive in terms of the CNAMEs that you put on your domain registrar, but I think for a home lab, the wildcard makes some sense. So now let's create that resource and you'll see what comes in the next step. So in the next step, we get to enable SSL or disable it. I obviously want to have SSL enabled. And then we get the target. And anyone who's used Cloudflare Tunnels, this is pretty much the exact same thing. So for this demo, I'm going to use HTTPS. I'm going to put in the IP address of this demo I've got of Portainer. And then I'm going to put the port, which defaults to 9443. Now this only works because my connector, which is running in that Docker host, you remember, it's got the address of 200.50. This sits in the same subnet, so that's going to have access to it. But if I put that connector, say, on its own VM or in a different Docker container with a different IP address on a different subnet, I'd be able to use my OpenSense firewall again as another barrier. So I could create, say, a whole separate VLAN, a whole separate subnet, just for services I want to have exposed through Pangolin, and then it would only be able to access those services. But anyway, let's click Add the Target. So now that's added, and we want to hit Save. And we can go to authentication down here and we can add some additional stuff. So much like Authentic or Authelia, this uses its own built-in single sign-on platform. And so when we actually try to access in a moment, I'll have to demonstrate it through something like a incognito window, we should be asked to log in. Now you can actually dial that down. So already we've only got valid users able to access this, but we could say that we want members, not just admins, to be able to access this, and then we could choose which users specifically we wanted. This would make a lot more sense if we had multiple users, and I imagine if you're expanding this out to your friends, family, or even work colleagues, etc., you'd be able to put in roles and people as you wish. What's also cool is down here at the bottom, we can add additional levels, such as we could add a password protection on top of it, or we could add just a simple PIN to do it. I'm going to add a bit of fun and let's put a PIN code on here. So we'll be very secure and we'll do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 and we'll enable that PIN protection. So now we should be able to go and access that. And remember that this is not port forwarded at the moment. So let me open up this new tab here. We're going to actually need to do a new incognito window because this one will have my credentials saved. I did actually end up having to load up Edge because it was caching my credentials. But in Edge, you can now see that we've got to the login page for this. So we are trying to access this Portainer here, but we've actually gone to the authentication. So you can either use a user or you can use a PIN. So I could put in my username and password, or we could put in that 123456, and then let's hit login. So now we've logged in and we've got to my Portainer, and then I could obviously just log into Portainer and it should behave as you expect. All with the benefits as well, remember, with Crowdsec on top of this. So all of that traffic that's being sent here is also being scanned. Awesome. So you can obviously then tweak this, you can change a resource, you can edit it, you can do whatever you want on here. But if we go back to the sites now, we should see that, yeah, some traffic has started flowing over that pipe, and that's because we access that through the internet. Now, that's pretty much all you need to do to get this up and running, and just add as many services, as many sites, as many users as you see fit, and you'll have complete control over what it is they can access, when they can access it, and how they can access it, i.e. what types of authentication and authorization. You can also create temporary links. So for example, we could go to that Portainer home lab. We could give it a title. Let's just say Portainer-temp. We could say 30 days, and then we could create a link. And now we could share this link with somebody. So let's copy that. And now hopefully if we paste that value in and hit return, access was granted. You saw that flash up. And then we've got 30 days access to this service. After 30 days, that access will be revoked and you shouldn't be able to use that link again, which is pretty awesome. We could obviously, if we wanted to, we could just quickly delete that link. And then I'm interested to see what actually happens now that that link has been deleted. If we try and refresh that, yeah, we're now back to the service. That token no longer works, so we have to log in via the traditional method. Excellent. And so as one little value add to this video, as I mentioned at the start, we could use the actual automated configuration, that wizard, to look at some of the files that were created. And also now, because we've set up some of those routes, those sites, etc., we can see how the configuration has dynamically altered. So if you go to the files here, you can see we've actually now got the corresponding compose files and configuration settings, etc. So you can see that here's the Docker Compose file. So rather than having to create this yourself, you can use that wizard to make it. You can see how all of this is cobbled together with the different containers, all being on the same network and being able to access each service through its DNS. You can also see how this is all pinned together with the use of things like APIs, and how when you update one system, it's got API calls between the systems to basically update that configuration on the fly. Now, within the actual config folder, you can see things like the config.yaml file for Pangolin itself and how this is all set up and architected. We can also see things like which different cause methods it's got, for example. And importantly, if we now go into the Traefik logs, we can see that we've got dynamic configurations. So here we've got actually Crowdsec set up, and that actually put that in during our installation when we asked to put it in. We can also see all of the security headers that's going on here, and then we can start to see some of these interesting things where we've got the routers for some of these services. And taking that one step further, let's exec into the Traefik container itself, because from in here we should be able to look at what the API is. So if we do a curl against the Pangolin container and use the API, you should see here now what we've got up and running. Now here you can see that there's a rule created for Portainer demos. Now if I actually go away now and delete that within my Pangolin, so if we actually want to test out how this works dynamically, we can delete this resource here. Once we've confirmed that, it should take about 5 seconds. I think that's the polling rate. If we head back now into our container that we've exec'd into, and if we run that command again, let's see if the Portainer now has disappeared. So now, as you can see, that is coming back as blank because we don't have any routes set up in there. So thanks for watching, everybody. Hopefully you found that demonstration useful. I think Pangolin is an awesome solution. If you're already down the road of using something like a Cloudflare tunnel, why not take full control over that tunnel and do it yourself? Sure, there are some benefits of having someone like Cloudflare doing it, especially if you're using, say, a public website and you want all the bells and whistles, i.e. the advanced security that Cloudflare no doubt has over something like Crowdsec. But if you want something that's self-hosted where you have all of the privacy, remember Cloudflare see everything that's in that tunnel, then Pangolin seems like an obvious choice, especially when you put on top of that things like Crowdsec, authentication, authorization, all of that good stuff. Anyway, if you've liked this video, please give it a thumbs up, hit that subscribe, and I'll see you on the next one. Take care, everybody.